Hey there guys, and welcome back. A little bit of a later stream today, but I've got coffee, so it should be good. So, let's see. Actually, I started on GitHub, but may as well start off over here and look at the times. So, did it Monday and today. Those are my 2 hours, 1 hour on Monday. Monday and Tuesday were pretty rough days for me at work. We were pretty busy, and it was some of the hottest days in the past couple weeks. So Monday, frankly, I was really unfocused, did not get nearly as much done, did a lot of typing and deleting. So Monday was not as productive. I did a pretty good job today though. So that's our 2 hours we're looking at. And one of those things, wanted to obviously get the stream in today so I can get another session started, hopefully tomorrow. So here we are at the changes. As previously noted, we'll be starting here, just taking a look and then hopping into specific code as we get there. So as the description on the video says, we mostly dealt with combat stuff. So as you can see here, I added in weapons and armor. And if you look over here, you'll see that weapons, the file actually deleted, and I replaced that with equipment. One of those things, once I started doing weapons, armor, and items, which are further down here, somewhere around here. Oh yeah, that's right, under equipment. For character, I actually did not add items in, I don't believe, just yet. Yeah, okay, I have a slot for items, but it doesn't look like I actually added it in just yet. One of those things, running around getting it done as much as possible. Plus, most of this part right here was done on Monday, which again was not my most focused day. So added in, like I said, items and armor, and started working over here on combat. That's what we got done. And yeah, that's the note I told you I was going to add. Back to properly citing your sources. So those are the changes, and now we'll look at them specifically. So hopping over to VS Code, and let's look at character really quick. So one of those things, this went from, I believe it was just weapons possibly, and went to an equipment object. So we got roles, statistics, and equipment now for our character. And then equipment, we got here weapons and armor. Again, need to come back and fill in items since I added items as well. Down here, actually, you know what? I'm going to skip this stuff for right now because this stuff is extra and we'll come into combat. We'll hop over to equipment. So one of those things, rather than having separate files for weapons, armor, and items, it made more sense to me to just put it all in equipment. A, fewer files. B, the fact of the matter is that armor right now is super limited. So let me show you that one. You'll notice here that I do not have armor type like I do for weapon and items. Weapons and items have an type, which is basically their base statistics, and then an instance version, which has specific information based on the item itself. Armor doesn't have that. Right now, armor is just simply a value. When it comes to a dark room, I actually am not sure that armor is anything other than just a damage reduction. I'll talk about another possibility when we get to combat, but as far as I can tell, it is just a status buff. So you get your iron armor, and then that's just replaced with steel armor. It's not actually something that you put on and off, unlike items and weapons. So in that vein, I just made this armor as a value. And back over on character, it just has a slot for armor. It does not have a full, for example, weapons is an array, and items, when I get that will be an array. So that's going to be the major difference here with armor, is that it is just basically a status buff. Moving on, and also the other thing I guess I should say about armor, moving into the future, back to this is going to be a mech based game. So your armor may very well end up being a mech. That is a possibility. I was thinking the character might be the mech. but it's possible that the mech may actually be the armor instead. One of those things. We'll develop that idea as we get further in. We are developing this program very quickly and on the fly, so one of those deals did not do a deep dive into what exactly I'm doing with the whole entire mech aspect. Moving on to weapons. Let's see. So update state, I rearranged a little bit because I realized that originally this function right here, or this if statement right here, was up here, and it said if this dot warm is not null originally. You'll recall that I actually changed warm up to use the ready state, charge state, etc. So that actually broke this part of it. So now we come through, we check for ready. If it's not ready, then we check for charged. And if it's not charged, that means that it is either fired or warming up. So one of those things. Actually, I just realized I do not have a fire check in here. I have the fire check up here, which is probably why I didn't think of it, because I saw fired up here. So I said, okay, you know what? Oh, that's what it is. Sorry. Not ready here. Back to Monday was very not focused. Bad focus on Monday. So this is inside of this bracket here. My bad. So yeah. So there's our ready. There's our fired. And then if it's not fired, and it's obviously not readied because we're inside of the bracket, then we check for charged. If it's not charged, then it's a number, and we can check the warm-up state. So there we go. I had this function declared earlier in the previous session. We finally went ahead and filled it out. Now, one interesting thing here is that I'm using Infinity, and basically this is just error catching. This is my version of error catching. If I wanted to make this a simpler program, I just assume that anytime that warm-up remaining is called, we are guaranteed that it is actually warming up. This is basically to handle the cases, these infinities are to handle the cases where this gets called when it really shouldn't be called. That's the only reason for it. Otherwise, if we are not provided with now, which is a possibility, obviously up here in the update state thing, we grab now at the very beginning so we have it available. But if we wanted to check warm up remaining on another screen for some reason, then we can go ahead and provide our own utils.now. Otherwise, it's very simply now minus this dot warmup. So this current time minus the when the warm up time started, we get that difference, and then we check, return rather, the difference between the total warm up time we need and the warm up time that has already accumulated. Moving down here, this clear state I threw in really quick. This is just to reset the weapon, and this is going to be at the start of combat, when combat first starts up, or potentially when combat ends. I can also call it to be on the safe side. But we can go ahead and call clear state, just a utility function that will get the weapon reset for the next combat. Or I was also thinking, in case we have a special item that automatically resets a weapon, that's another possibility. Up here in fire, so first off, two utility functions just for determining what can be fired and what can't. Obviously, is available is anything that's not on cooldown, and is fireable is anything that is immediately able to deal damage. So the weapon has... I don't know if that I necessarily vocalized this in the last video, in the last stream, but in a dark room that had guns, right? And the guns are projectile weapons. So rather than having a warm-up state, really what it had was a projectile state. So the gun would fire, and then while the bullet was moving, the gun would then start reloading. I've actually reversed that in this game because that, well, frankly, it didn't make sense with guns to begin with, since, well, short of, again, I talked about this briefly, if a dark room you are actually some kind of Eldritch Abomination, then it's possible as an Eldritch Abomination you are actually moving at hypersonic speeds, in which case you would actually be able to see the bullet moving through the air like you do on screen in a dark room. But assuming that's not the case, then that's kind of weird that you can actually see the bullet flying across the screen. In this game, because I'm fully embracing the fact that we're flying mechs and whatnot, there is no real projectile speed. Everything is assumed to be close enough to instantaneous. We don't have any characters moving at hypersonic speeds, and therefore the warm-up mechanic, the projectile mechanic, happens before the cooldown starts going. So for that reason, this cooldown will never be ready until after, or it should never be ready, I guess I should say, until after the weapon has fired. Or has started. Wow, okay, it is late. This will be on cooldown the second the weapon fires, is what I was trying to get at. So if the weapon is charged and has not fired yet, this cooldown is still on ready. So the weapon is available and is fireable if it has a warm-up and it has not been fired and it has, completed its warm-up. If it has not fired and is in the middle of charging up, then it is available, but it is not fireable. That's all I was trying to get there. Sorry to hit the mic. But that's all I was trying to get across there. One of those things. Late at night, I am getting a bit jumbled up. So, let's see. That's these two utility functions that took longer to explain than necessary. This fire here is frankly something that I considered not putting in. This is basically just me future-proofing this. So this stuff right here, this dot cooldown equals now, and if this warm up, then state turns to fired. I actually was thinking about putting that over into combat, and when we get to combat, I'll talk about some ideas and processes that I went through in putting this together. But I was thinking about removing that from weapons and just letting combat take care of that to make things simpler. But I decided that there's a possibility that weapons could get more advanced in the future, that we might end up with more complicated systems in the future for fire. And therefore I gave the weapon its own fire thing, and combat will call, after it deals the damage with the weapon, it will call the weapon to use fire. And we'll look at that in a minute. That way, if weapons need to do any extra functionality, needs to do any extra routines after they've been fired, they can go ahead and do that here, and I don't have to go into combat itself and update combat. And we talked about armor. Alright, items. Items are a new type that I've added. One of those things, this is like bolas or eating meat in a dark room. So these are things that do special stuff in combat. They do not simply fire and deal damage. So here, looking at this, obviously ID, that's whatever. Target is a special case right here. It's either self or enemy. And this is, right now, honestly, all it is just an indication for usage purposes. It doesn't actually have any in-game mechanics because everything is handled by this callback function. And this is, I have it defined as a combat callback in the documentation here. So if we come over to combat, you can see that a combat callback in the documentation is defined as a callback, a function, and it takes a character, which is the activator, and a character, which is the opponent. And I gotta supply both of those things because I don't know, for example, if the item is a self type, then it probably only needs just the activator. But if it is a damage type or a stun type or something like that, if it inflicts something to the enemy, then it actually probably only needs the enemy. It's one of these things that I don't really know which it will need, so I just supply both. And there are obviously cases where it might actually affect both. It might affect both self and enemy. But that is the situation. So instead of designing each and every single item as its own class, I'm just going to supply a function for each and every item, and then when that item type gets defined, it will just get that function tacked on. Then obviously we have is consumable and cooldown. Cooldown I actually added at the very last second here because I realized I didn't do it. So I don't actually have cooldown code written yet. And furthermore, I forget how multiple inheritances work in JavaScript, but it may be one of those things. It might make more sense to have a cooldown like class add-on, whatever, mix in, whatever you want to call it, and then apply that to both to weapons and to items. But one of those things, again, it's not something I've done much in JavaScript to begin with, so I'm not saying that's going to end up in here. I may just very well just code in cooldown exactly like I do for weapons. Otherwise, the item class itself works just like the weapon class does. So it has an item type. It has a quantity, back to is consumable. The quantity matters. I considered not doing this. I considered having each and every single unit of a consumable one be its own separate item instance. But that didn't make very much sense if I included cooldown. Because if I did not have the quantity here and it's consumable, then in theory I just delete the item, and now the item no longer has a reference to cooldown. So it makes more sense to use quantity. And then really quick, again, I did not fill out much for items in this session, but I at least added in use, which is just if it's consumable, reduce the quantity by 1, minimum 0, so don't go to -1. And that is all the stuff we got in equipment. I think that's everything. Just want to double check. And that gets us to the last part. Oh, and technically the last major part. I did have minor changes in character, but we'll get to that in just a second. Let me pick my mic up. I'm hunching a little bit. It drooped on me. All right, there we go. No longer super low. Also, if I sound a little bit stuffy, we are moving into fall at this point, so allergies. All right, got some more coffee. Good to go. So, combat is an interesting idea. I decided to make it an object because, in theory, you're only going to have one combat running at it. Well, I didn't need to because you're only going to have one combat running at a time, but I figured it's easier just to create a new combat instance and then destroy it at the end so that there's no confusion. So that's why I made it its own individual object to be initialized. And here you can see we have player, enemy, and then I've got this victor flag, which it's one of these deals where I think it makes sense, but I'm not 100% sold on it. One thing that should be noted is stuff like this. I have a couple of these notes around here where a dark room, you only have 1v1 combat, and therefore we are only going to have 1v1 combat in this game. But in theory, this whole all these places where I'm just talking about, for example, let's call that the opponent, or right here, the enemy. This is all 1v1 terminology that, may be a problem if we decide that we wanted multiple enemy combat. But that is a problem down the street that we don't know is coming up or not. So, the one thing that I have implemented, I've implemented a few things, but basically everything that I've implemented revolves around this combat stack. Now, I decided to do the stack before the loop. In theory, this stack should be called intermittently inside of a combat loop. So basically the combat loop will run through, check stuff, etc. And then it will put a whole bunch of things on the combat stack, and then the combat stack will resolve. Now right now I only have player commands on the combat stack, or that get passed on to the combat stack. The combat stack does a variety of things, but I don't know that there's anything else really. The only other option is the only other thing that could potentially be added to this is environment effects or damage over time, which I have kind of noted right here. If there's a reason to handle those or to pass them into the combat stack, either handle them in the combat loop or pass them into the combat stack, then this will have to be modified. But for right now, this seemed to make the most amount of sense to me. So we start off with player commands. So since the last time we went through the combat loop should have, hopefully, assuming the player's not AFKing, accumulated some commands from the player. Use this weapon, use this item, etc., etc., etc. In most cases, because it's a computer, because we're doing this on a computer, chances are that there's only going to be exactly, or at least minimum one, there's going to be probably max one, minimum 0, honestly, player commands on each loop, because it's looping however many times a second, and a player is not going to input commands multiple times a second in most cases. Maybe 2. They might get 2 in a second, but anything more than that with just point and click mechanics, may not happen. So we have 4 player commands. I made a player's action object. This may be overkill. This may not be super necessary. All it is an object with an action type and an object to use. So as you can see, that honestly could just be an array. That could just be a 2-element array. I am not sure whether or not I'm going to just delete this and go back to a 2-element array. I just figured for readability and for usefulness, it's nice to have this. Otherwise, 2 types of player actions that I can think of at the moment in a darkroom are weapons and items. Either you're shooting the guy, stabbing the guy with weapons, or you're healing yourself using a consumable item, and that's an item. Oops, Control Z. I can't recall anything else in combat other than those 2 options off the top of my head, at any rate. It's one of those things I can always go back and check, but I went ahead and made several basically subroutines here. This was not 100% necessary. I just figured the enemy, for handle weapon, the enemy can also use this. So it makes sense to break this out into a function and just have one function instead of it repeated twice. The handle item, the enemies, as far as I know, and this is noted right here, as far as I know, the enemies only ever just spam attack. So handle item maybe should have just been some code right here rather than being a whole another function. But at this point, I figured it made more sense just to break that out. Handle KO makes a lot more sense because, as you can see, we handle KO after we attack and after the enemy attacks. Well, we attack or use an item, and after the enemy attacks. So that's in multiple places. Plus, we might want to check that in other parts of the gameplay loop, the combat loop. So it makes sense for that to be its own function. So that was my rationale there. And then you can see here, this is why I made those utility functions on weapons. So is available and is fireable. And I added sister functions to the character. So first available weapon and first fireable weapon. Again, the AIs are just stupid. They're just going to grab the first thing available. That's just how it's going to be. So that's all I made up. Again, we do have a random, get random weapon here. So that's definitely an option. But I don't know when we're ever going to use it. Again, I believe I mentioned in the first stream, maybe that's a debuff. Maybe that's a random effect that causes, the player to use a random weapon. I just thought it was an interesting idea and decided to put it in the first stream. Otherwise, again, we're just handling the weapon. And I guess at this point, I may as well just look at it really quick. So this right here is error checking. And just like over on equipment, where I said with warm-up remaining, that this stuff was all kind of stupid and pointless because we should never be calling this if this was invalid to begin with. And furthermore, if you read the comments, I mentioned, a lot of this stuff really should be just errors that cause it to fail. And the reason I'm not using errors is because I don't A, feel like having the script error handle, and B, I don't feel like accidentally having the game crash while the player's playing it. So that's the reason why I'm avoiding errors right now instead of just raising them in this game. So here we check if it's fireable and available, because otherwise we've called the weapon function and at an inappropriate time. And in either of those cases, we just, split. We just say, you know what, this is not working. The exception obviously being, it may not be fireable, but it may be available. So if it's available but not fireable, that means that it's a warm-up weapon, or at least it should be. Again, we got to check here to make sure. But if it is a warm-up weapon, then we can start charging it up. Otherwise, if none of that's a problem, if it is fireable and it is available, then one of those things, go ahead and fire it. So for combat, right now I'm just doing weapon type dot damage minus armor dot value, minimum of 1 damage. So I'm making sure that we don't deal 0 damage. I don't want the player to get stuck in a loop where they're just staring at the combat where nothing happens because both players have either 2 weak weapons or 2 high armor. Combat needs to end. So one of those things, that's why I am putting this minimum of 1 damage in here. Otherwise, one other thing that I said I was going to get around to when we started talking about combat, I forgot that evasion is a thing in A Dark Room, because I've only seen it like once or twice while playing the game. And I don't know, first off, I don't recall my character ever missing an attack, but I may have just not seen it. I believe I've only ever seen enemies miss attack. So it's one of these situations where I'm not really sure whether to put in evasion score in or to put in accuracy score in. So the evasion score would go on probably armor, possibly on the character. Actually, you know what? I might do it on the character over the armor, but back to if we're using mechs as armor, then actually that would make more sense on the mech, on the armor, than on the character, the pilot. However, the precision thing, the accuracy, that would end up going on the weapon as a modifier probably, and possibly also on the character. So I have to figure out at this point what exactly I'm doing with that. One of those things, not something I decided to tackle in this session. So that is a problem for the future. We do have to figure out what the miss chance is and add that into this handle weapon function. Otherwise, after we fire the weapon, then we call weapon.fire. As I already explained, the weapon is handling the fire procedure because it may become more complicated in the future. So rather than coming back over here and updating it way down here in the combat, we're just going to put it into the weapon because that's a logical place to find it. Handle item, very simply, Control Z, very simply handle item. We've got a callback on the item, so we just pass it the activator and the opponent and let it do its thing. One of those things, items can be so varied that I'm not even going to attempt to do anything with it in this function. And then similarly, just like weapon.fire, as previously explained, we're going to let the item decide what needs to happen after it is used. And finally, we have handle KO here. So very simply, the character I added onto character is KO'd, and all that is current HP less than 0, less than or equal to 0. That's all I'm doing for it right now. And therefore we check if the player is KO'd, then the victor is the enemy. If the enemy is KO'd, then the victor is the player. And if victor is not null, as in if there is a victor, then we return true. Otherwise we return false. And the reason we're returning a boolean here is so that during the combat stack, if at any point the combat ends, we do handle KO and the result here ends up being true, then we can just exit immediately. So we have early exit points is what that gives us. The alternative is to handle KO and then check it, move this check, move if the victor is not none up here. That's more code in this block. That's why I didn't do that. That was my rationale there. It would be probably safer and more correct to do that, but I decided not to. And I believe that is... Let me pull up GitHub really quick and see if I missed anything. So the equipment tab is not going to help me because everything's new, because equipment.js did not exist before. Combat.js also did not exist before, so I think I didn't miss anything there anyway. Let's see. Character, we already went over weapons and armor and equipment. And then all those... Oh, I didn't do weapon updates. That's right, I didn't talk to you guys about those guys. So let me go ahead and talk about that really quick. Okay, so equipment. We obviously have this update state right here, right? So on to, this is a 3-second thing. Over here on character, I have update weapons, and it just cycles through weapons and calls update state on all of them. One of those things, multiple weapons can be on cooldown or warming up at the same time. So for that reason, I made these utility functions so that at the end of the combat stack, any changes to the weapons are registered. So that is that. Again, that's a 3-second explanation. Does not need to be complicated. Just a utility function to make sure that all the weapons get their states updated, even if they weren't used in this specific combat, because they may have changed over time back to warm up and cool down. So yeah, I believe that is everything now. Excuse me. So part of me was hoping I'd be able to get done combat in session 2. I think so. One of these deals where obviously I've mentioned a few things that I hadn't considered prior to actually starting combat. So obviously it was going to take longer than I expected because there were extra things that I didn't foresee. At the same time, if Monday was not such a bad day for me for programming, I think there's a possibility that, although incomplete, I might have been able to put together a quick combat demo over here in game. Just really quick, put together a combat, new combat, etc., etc., etc. Do a run combat or something like that. I think that's a possibility. But as it is, that did not happen. So I'm thinking, hopefully, let me put it this way. If I don't get it done in the first half of the next session, then that would, solve that issue right there. That would be a clear indication that regardless of how Monday went, there's no way I was getting it done in this session. But hopefully, point being, by the time we review session 3, I will have combat fully functional, and then we can move on to the other aspects of the game. That is the game plan moving forward, so hopefully within the next 2 hours of coding, we can get that done. And we will be, when combat gets done, I'm trying to think. So if we don't count stuff like dialogue and item creation, armor creation, etc. So if we don't count all the creative stuff, then it would be, we'd have the home base stuff, for example, your little widgets that gather your materials. So we'd have to program that. We'd have events. We'd have the map, actual moving around the map. And then we'd also have map generation, since map generation should be randomized. And then encounters, random encounters on the map. So that's a different type of encounter. So with combat done, I'm guessing we're maybe 10% of the way through there. So if we're 10% of the way through after, let's say, 5 hours. Again, assuming I get done combat in the first hour of the next session. Let's see, that's 5. I said 10%, right? So that's 5 times 10, so that's 50 hours. So we're just over a full work week to finish the game. If that's what we're talking about. I guess it's a work week and a quarter, technically, mathematically speaking. So it's a little bit more than just over one work week. But I'm just thinking, what would make me happy? Would 80 hours, getting the whole entire thing done in 80 hours, make me happy? It's an interesting idea. It's an interesting question. You know, for a minimalist game, again, back to A Dark Room, calls itself a minimalist game, and I'm going to attempt to keep this as a minimalist game as well. I'm going to attempt to not let this feature creep. So, assuming I'm able to do that, would I be happy with, say, 80 hours of work into this project to get a finished game similar in quality to A Dark Room? I guess I'll find out moving forward. It's an interesting idea. An interesting question. Not a question I asked myself before we started, but now that I'm getting ready, hopefully, to hit the first milestone, it's probably a question I should ask. So, anyway, that's it from me. Again, I will not be doing project updates at the end of these videos because I want to keep this series focused. So if you're interested on where I'm at with all the rest of the projects, just tune into other videos. Simple enough. Otherwise, look forward to another entry in this series. Let's see. Today is currently, in current time and not when you're watching this, Wednesday. I'll probably have D&D. We haven't talked about it, but I'm gonna have D&D possibly on Friday. If we don't have D&D on Friday, and I can get a session in, get both hours of the session in between Thursday and Friday, which is very, very possible, then maybe Friday night, so maybe 2 days from now, I do another update for session number 3. So look forward to that one. Let's shoot for Friday as our next reconvening day. Next update day. And yep, that's everything now. So thank you guys for watching. If you have been, remember, still looking for feedback on what font to use for the logo. What you think looks nice. If you haven't seen the first episode, go watch the first episode. I do go over all the fonts I pulled for in that one, so you can go ahead and leave a comment on which one you like best. And otherwise, I hope you have a great and wonderful day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at in the world. And I'll catch you next time.